Hello and welcome to the Presto Classical Podcast. We have a very special show coming up as we are going on a Scandinavian sojourn, exploring the culture, landscape and history of the Nordic nations with a very special tour guide. Andrew Mellor, what so inspired you about the Nordic nations that you moved to Copenhagen in 2015?
Well, good question, Paul. In a sense, it was a kind of opportune move because I spotted that there was an absence of an English language correspondent here for a number of opera and music magazines. But I was really interested in Scandinavian culture. It came quite late to me. I was kind of, raised on Britten and Wagner, and around about, I guess, the mid-noughties, I started to become interested in Finland, this very distinct culture, mainly through photography and painting, and then kind of worked my way back a little bit through the Nordic countries, started taking little weekend trips, and it snowballed from there really. And I was working on Gramophone magazine at the time, and before that Classic FM magazine, and seeing this wealth of recordings coming out of these countries, and orchestras that seemed to really mean business, and new concert halls and opera houses springing up. So it seemed like a fun place to come and explore for what was supposed to be a year but has ended up being a little longer.
We start, of course, with Denmark's most famous musical son, Carl Nielsen. Andrew, which symphony of his 6 have you picked as a fine example of Danish culture in music?
Well, we're going to go with the third, which was actually my own way into Nielsen's music. And it's just a tremendous piece, but it shows us both sides of Nielsen, really, the sort of popular composer, songwriter, and Nielsen the symphonist, and also Nielsen's own sort of personal struggle, I think, between his roots, this kind of rural poor boy made good, and his ultimate status, which was, Denmark's national composer. And that's a really interesting thing for Danes. Hans Christian Andersen obviously was a poor boy made good from the same island as Nielsen. And it's a long-running theme in Denmark and to some extent throughout Scandinavia. But this symphony really sums it up, I think.
It's fair to say that Nielsen's Third Symphony isn't perhaps one of his most popular symphonies outside of Denmark, but would it be right to say that it's the most Danish of his symphonies? And if so, why would that be?
Yeah, it certainly is one of the most Danish, actually probably the most Danish, because from the Fourth Symphony onwards, Nielsen was really sort of exploring the avant-garde and making statements, about international affairs, war and so on. And in the Sixth Symphony, the sort of state of music. But in this piece, the third, it's no less important and no less progressive in many ways, because we really sense Nielsen testing, pushing symphonic form in a very kind of Danish way. So the last movement, it's best to kind of deal with the fact that the last movement is slightly different in terms of the fact that it's kind of just this broad song, a tune that may well have formed one of Carl Nielsen's many songs. He wrote hundreds of songs in his lifetime, and they're still sung today. And when I say they're still sung today, I really mean they are sung today. During the pandemic lockdown, the state broadcaster gave over each morning on television to a sort of communal national sing-song, in which the idea was families would just gather round and sing these songs together with a guy on the piano on television. And a lot of the songs were Carl Nielsen. People just know them. They're not art songs. They're kind of more like folk songs. So we have in the last movement this feeling of the broad, very kind of Funen style song, Funen the island Nielsen was from, with a kind of flat horizon and kind of big sky. And in the first movement, just this furious energy, the energy that's carried forward into the later symphonies. And in my mind, in real confrontation with Nielsen, the kind of young rural lad from the countryside, you get this sophisticated waltz theme, and you get this kind of rural triad combined, fighting each other. And I think in the excerpt we're going to hear, we hear them, there's the moment of rupture where these two things just rub up against each other in the symphony and explode in this kind of fissile way.
Okay, well, let's hear an excerpt then. This is, of course, Carl Nielsen's Third Symphony, performed by the Gothenburg Symphony Orchestra and conducted by Myung-Whun Chung. you say, Andrew, that there's a connection between the Danish language and Nielsen's unique symphonic style?
Yeah, I think to some extent there is. And, the reason for starting in Denmark is because a lot of Scandinavians, Nordic people won't thank me for saying so, but things kind of start linguistically, if you discount Finland, from Denmark, because it was the colonial power for so many years. And the Danish language, of course, basically shaped what we know as modern Norwegian. Norwegians and the Swedes find it just unfathomable that this language is so kind of guttural, and it doesn't at all sound like the kind of airy-fairy Scandinavian that we think of, which is, more or less a hybrid of Norwegian and Swedish. Danish is sort of staccato. It's at the back of the throat, a mouthful of potatoes that the Norwegians say you need to have. The opening of almost all the Nielsen symphonies actually open with this sort of breathless, kind of quite sort of staccato, fissile, guttural sound, and I've always felt there's a connection. I mean, Danish has a lyricism, a wonderful lyricism. You hear it in Nielsen's operas and his songs, but I also think that the force of the language, Danish is a fantastic language to be angry in. I think the force of the language really comes across in the symphonies.
Fantastic. And Nielsen, of course, paved the way for a wide variety of contemporary Danish composers, including Vagen Humboy, Per Norgard, Hans Abrahamsen, and our next composer, a composer who actually lives close to Andrew in Copenhagen. Andrew, why have you picked a piece by Bent Sorensen as a prime example of contemporary Danish composition?
Well, I think Sorensen's music is really beautiful. Fundamentally, there's good enough reason, but I also think he's quite a fascinating figure in the sense that he taps into this idea of melancholy and the sort of the dark side of the Scandinavian mindset in many ways. But yeah, he's a craftsman. His music is so distinct, so recognizable, and recently very much acclaimed. He won the Gromeyer Prize, and thanks to Da Capo, we've had plenty of recordings of his music coming.
And which recording have you selected as an example?
Well, we're going to hear an excerpt from the most recent recording from Bent Sorensen, which is a disc of 3 concertos. And this is the piano concerto played by Leif Ove Ansnes. Sorensen plays with a chorale tune in this concerto. Like many of his pieces, you only really hear the full expression right in the dying seconds. So in this piece, the piano kind of tries to sing out this chorale, but really only can do so for the very end of the last 4th movement. Similar thing happens in the trumpet concerto. Similar thing happens in the clarinet concerto, and in the first piano concerto, and in the violin concerto. This is the second of the piano concertos. Obviously, the chorale is a sort of way in for many people as well. So I think it's a good example of how Sorensen kind of creates his own very distinct world from kind of existing material.
That was Bent Sorensen's La Matana, performed by Leif Ove Ansnes, the Norwegian Chamber Orchestra, and conducted by Per Christian Skalstad. Yes, Andrew, I was fascinated by the almost apathetic way in which Bach's Lutheran chorale is used here in La Matana. It's very different to perhaps the famous usage of Bach's in, say, Berg's Violin Concerto. Is this perhaps a commentary on the declining role of Lutheranism and religion generally in Danish society?
I wouldn't put it quite like that. I mean, I think Danish society has always been quite secular, and in the same way it's always been, pretty much hardwired into the church, a state church here in Denmark, where everybody pays a church tax unless they opt out. I mean, Luther is everywhere. In a city like Copenhagen, you can't move for Lutheran churches, and by that I mean built in the Lutheran style, with these glass windows, a sort of certain austerity. The idea being that, you look out at God's work through the windows in nature to understand the kind of basis of Lutheran faith. There aren't many churchgoers in Denmark, but Lutheranism is a sort of huge cultural force still. It's kind of lies behind the basis of the social democratic system that underpins life here. It's very much behind a lot of the sort of social codes of conduct, a certain propriety, huge levels of trust, both in the government and each other. Of course, the eradication of poverty. This was effectively a Lutheran principle turned into a government policy, a high tax welfare state. And also, I think we often talk about national identity and it's important to realise that a lot of people in Denmark have no connection to Luther specifically and to the chorale tradition that came out of Luther. But then we all listen to the national anthem. We all, at the World Cup, we all hear 15, 20 national anthems based on Lutheran hymnody. And I think it's kind of impossible not to escape this. I was talking to Ben Sorensen once about this because he's writing a St. Matthew Passion, and I asked him if he's a religious man. And he said, well, I'm not a churchgoer and I don't have a particularly strong faith, but you just cannot deny the DNA of this country and the culture and, even the doubters, the religious doubters who formed such a strong part of the conversation here, and it seems to me a kind of inescapable truth really in Scandinavia, but both musically, culturally and politically.
And we'll be exploring Norway's attitude to Lutheranism later on in the show. Now, another strong Scandinavian tradition is a very negative outlook on life in literature and the arts. One thinks of the existentialism of Kierkegaard, the psychological dramas of Ibsen, perhaps most famously the terror of Munch's The Scream. Yet Scandinavians continually top opinion polls of the happiest nations on earth. How can you explain this dichotomy?
I wish I could explain it, Paul. I'm working on a book at the moment trying to piece together some of the big themes about Nordic music in relation to Nordic culture, and this is one of the chapters. It's really fascinating, and Ben Sorensen actually is a good example of someone who kind of personifies it. You meet him, he insists he's very happy and he's has a wonderful life, and then you kind of hear his music, and it's kind of very difficult to imagine that he's being honest with you. But I mean, part of it is Scandinavians have low expectations. They're quite easily pleased in some ways. There's no point worrying in Scandinavia about getting rich, because the richer you get, the more money you'll have to give to the state. You'll end up holding on to a tiny proportion of it. And there's no point worrying about getting poor, because you won't get poor because of the social welfare system. So I think in a country far away where this isn't as rich and lucky as Denmark, people are worried about where their next meal is coming from. And I think in Scandinavia there's a tendency now that everything works so perfectly and sort of systems are in place to protect people that people start to think about why they're alive and what the point of life is. So the introspection is a huge thing, of course. Alcohol, weather, these things play into it. But I remember when I first moved to Copenhagen in the summer of 2015, spring of 2015, we'd all been watching The Killing on TV in England. This fantastic TV series in which Copenhagen is constantly dark, constantly wet. Everyone's grappling with self-doubt and communication issues, even the good guys. And then I arrived here and it was just blazing sunshine, 18 hours a day, and everybody wandering around with a beer with broad smiles on their face and swimming in the harbours. I think it's very much a case of, Scandinavians like to live their emotions to the season. So they enjoy being a little bit melancholy in winter. They enjoy letting loose in summer. And they kind of almost, like to go with it a bit and compartmentalize. But, there's an awful lot of minor keyed, slow, drony music coming out of Scandinavia now. And when you look at it, there was in the 1700s and earlier even, Buxtehude was Danish, born in Danish-controlled Sweden. And it's funny how his music, seems to get a little bit more major and jubilant the closer he gets to travelling south to Lübeck, where he eventually ended up. But yeah, it's a big thing, and I think it has to do with the duality and to do with mindset, and also certain comfort with dark thoughts and deep expression.
Perhaps it's an image that they like to present to the world of themselves, even though it's not necessarily how they feel themselves.
Yeah, well, yeah, and I think even more so it's an image that we like to project onto them. There's a certain exoticism about the Scandinavian melancholy, but that's an academic trope, and lots of academics would argue that. But having lived here, these people can be seriously melancholic. And in Denmark, it goes back to what you said about language. There's no word for please. You have to work extremely hard to get a thank you out of somebody. And talking to a stranger in the street is more or less, akin to assault. So, it's different.
Okay, well, I think we best off leave Copenhagen behind then and follow the path of many a Viking and head out towards the North Sea. And we first stop off on the Faroe Islands, a tiny island situated between Scotland and Iceland. Andrew, what music awaits us as we step off the ferry?
Well, lots of music actually would literally await you as you stepped off the ferry or plane, I think, probably, Paul, because it's a long ferry journey. But the Faroes is again, this is something that's going to be a focus in the book I'm working on. It's a really unique set of circumstances. A kind of, if you think of Iceland being this incredible musical ecosystem in miniature, full of talent, then the Faroes kind of focuses it down even more. You have a very kind of inbuilt music tradition where music is not sort of something that's done for kind of commercial or even particularly intellectual means. It's just a community activity. There's a very strong tradition of chain dancing, reciting the ballads in a chain dance, which is effectively a song, even though it's called a dance. This is the sort of thing that Sibelius was exploring in Finland, their equivalent, but in the Faroes it still happens and it's still taught in schools. It's a kind of living vernacular tradition. And it's really interesting to watch a country kind of form itself musically. There's a composer there, Sunleif Rasmussen, who is becoming well known internationally, has had his pieces performed at the Barbican in London and elsewhere, and the sort of flotilla of activity forming around him and this very strong popular music culture, which cannot help but cross-fertilise because everybody knows everybody. So, the pop singers, Ava and Tato, they know Sunleif. They get him to orchestrate their pieces sometimes. And it forms this really fascinating, rich musical ecosystem.
You mentioned there Tato. I believe we have an excerpt from Taito's 2016 album, Confessions.
Yeah, this is an album that Tato made with Nico Muhly, the American composer. I mean, Tato, like a lot of Faroese musicians, Ava Pálsdóttir, the most famous, it's kind of difficult to pin down. They don't really see classical music as something different. They'll produce a classical album and then another pop album afterwards. It's just the sort of the way they work, and I think it's quite wonderful, really. And this piece is one of my favourites from this album, which is really beautiful, made with the Holland Baroque Society.
The world has many faces. Some of them reside in small spaces. Very little rooms.
So that was Small Spaces from Confessions, an album by Taito and Nico Muhly. What struck me about this was the complete lack of artifice on this album, and a combination with sort of a neo-barockery, which you think wouldn't work at all, but yet somehow does.
Yeah, I completely agree. And also, funnily enough, well, actually, Tato made an album many years ago before this called The Singer, and the first song, he kind of literally just sits at the piano and says, sings, I always wanted to be a singer, and now, here I am singing about what I'm feeling, and you paid to hear it, and you're sitting here and listening, and isn't this all weird? It's sort of very literal description of his art, and there's a certain sense to me that he's distilled, he's wanted to sort of distill his artistry right down over the years, and he did so in The Singer, and then with this album with Nico Muhly, he does again, but in a slightly different direction, and a total lack of artifice, like you say, and this wonderful voice. He's got this such a frank, beautiful voice. He came on television live one Friday night during the early days of the lockdown here in Denmark, because of the relationship between the Faroe Islands and Denmark. He's very well known here, and sang live one of his songs from the side of a mountain on the Faroes with this huge seascape behind him, the sun sort of slowly setting. It certainly wasn't small spaces of the song we just heard. But it was just a wonderful moment. And I think his voice is such a special instrument.
You mentioned there the relationship between the Faroes and the Kingdom of Denmark. Now, the Faroe Islands are an autonomous region within the Kingdom of Denmark, but do they manage to maintain a distinct cultural identity from Denmark and Scandinavia in general?
They do. I mean, they're very much an independent nation, and that vernacular music tradition I mentioned is part of it. And Sundleif Rasmussen, the composer, is busy kind of forging a national sound in art music, in notated music, much like Sibelius Grieg did before him. There are members of parliament, both the Faroes, sitting in the Danish government. The Queen of Denmark is also the Queen of the Faroe Islands, and there's a lot of crossover because students are sent here to study, prisoners are sent here to serve their sentences. It's still the sort of sovereign nation in some ways.
We now continue on our northwards journey to Iceland, an island that has appropriately seen an eruption of creative compositional energy in the past few years. Andrew, what have you picked as an example of this?
Well, we're going to hear a piece by Anna Thorvaldsdottir. I mean, sure, she'll be very well known to many people because she's sort of emblematic of this new generation of Icelandic composers who have, off the back of, I guess, the legacy of Jon Leifs, the first great Icelandic composer, have continued to explore the kind of the very specific geology, topology of their country in music. And Anna does so in a way that's just really fascinating and beautiful. The orchestra really is her medium, and we've seen, orchestras falling over themselves to commission her. She was a Kravis young composer at the New York Philharmonic, and she works a lot with orchestras around the world, has a Berlin Philharmonic premiere next season. And the way she writes for orchestras is mesmerizing. I mean, you can talk about the Icelandic features in it, the kind of the reflection of various features of Iceland in sound, but also you can just revel in what is really beautiful music.
So that was Dreaming by Anna Thorvaldsdottir, performed by the Iceland Symphony Orchestra and conducted by Daniel Bjarnason. I often get the sense with these Icelandic composers that their time has very much come, in that all these extended orchestral techniques are really a wonderful way of expressing the Icelandic landscape, and without them it wouldn't be possible to do so. And whereas in other contemporary composers these techniques may seem forced or a bit gimmicky, here they seem totally natural as a way of expressing Iceland.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, I think it's also this idea that spectralism, there's a kind of new spectralism from these composers. And Anna talks about, how, nature is not just an inspiration. It's also a sort of technical tool, really, if you're a composer. Like she said once here in Copenhagen that nature tells you that brown is never just brown. If you're thinking about an orchestral colour and how an orchestra can sort of twist its colour palette slowly, there are many clues in nature. There's so much that kind of unifies these composers. It's fascinating to me. Lots of them that are being recorded by this fantastic series from the Iceland Symphony Orchestra on Sonoluminous, which is proving to be a really wonderful resource. You can sort of see how they're each responding to the same landscape in slightly different ways, but the crossover is really striking to me. The kind of effect that this place has on on the language. I mean, even Björk's albums from her period where she moved back to Iceland have a lot of the same techniques in them too. You know, they use pedal notes, they use the open fifth, which Leif's used. They use kind of, in Björk's case, like volcanic percussion sounds. And yeah, how a country can be so absorbed in its own landscape, you can really only understand when you go to Iceland and see it, because it's just unique.
So, one of the most famous Icelandic compositions is, of course, Leif's Hekla, a vivid tone poem depicting Iceland's famous volcano, once marketed as the loudest piece of classical music ever written. But is it now a cliché or somewhat reductive to review all Icelandic compositions through the prism of their extreme, almost alien landscape? What other aspects of Icelandic culture are represented in the increasing number of talented Icelandic composers?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is, in a sense, a cliche, although it's very fascinating to do so and very revealing. And also interesting to look at how foreign composers living in Iceland have responded to the landscape. But yeah, you're right. There's a huge range of music in Iceland across genres. Björk is still doing the most incredible work. There's Canadians, Americans doing great work there. And of course, you know, Iceland sits between Europe and America, this, you know, the product of this great tectonic struggle between the two continents. So there's been a huge influx of American influence into the country. I mean, what's interesting is that there's a lot of crossover. So there's really only one place in Reykjavik where you can study music at a high level, higher education level, and everyone passes through it. So lots of people end up playing in each other's bands. Lots of orchestral musicians end up playing in rock groups, DJing, and DJs end up working with orchestras, etc. So it's a lot bigger than a handful of composers' response to the landscape. But I do think that the idea of landscape sort of permeates the music in different ways. It's not always something that's so obviously audible. And I also do think that Iceland has, by nature of its kind of melting pot, has a kind of very unusual musical ecosystem when put in context of the rest of the world.
Okay, well, thank you. Well, turning back now towards the Scandinavian mainland, and a composer who I'm sure we'll all be familiar with, but aside of his compositional output, which hasn't travelled as far as his famous piano concerto. This is the third of Edvard Grieg's 4 Psalms, Opus 74, his last completed composition, performed by the Norwegian Soloist Choir and conducted by Greta Pedersen Helgerod. Andrew, I was astonished by the strong religious feeling in this work by a composer best known for that concerto and charming salon miniatures. Church attendance in Norway currently averages just 5%, but what other aspects of Lutheranism have manifested themselves in Norway's secular politics? And how much of Scandinavia's famed social democracy is derived from its religious tradition?
Yeah, it's very interesting that Scandinavia has this low church attendance rate, and yet has such a strong Lutheran identity. And as we were saying earlier, this is connected to the state church, the idea of the church as a sort of social institution more than a religious one. I mean, Luther himself preached about the priesthood of all believers, as in there should be no hierarchy in the kind of order of things. The priest is just another member of the congregation who leads people. And Grieg had a real disdain for clergymen. He hated Norwegian clergymen, and I think he had a very particularly Scandinavian attitude to religion as something quite personal. And we really hear that in the Psalms, especially as this soloist sort of steps out and sings on his own, and with the choir behind him, echoing him and or responding to him. And I think a lot of Scandinavians, they see sort of church as something that you go to for your confirmation, which is the sort of the confirmation as we call it in Britain, but it's a big thing in in the Nordic countries where kind of everybody does it and it's a coming of age party. And also then Christmas. But apart from that, it's a sort of building which you pay to maintain and you hope is in nice, pristine condition for when you get married, etc. I mean, also, as we were saying before, social democracy is the kind of big project was the eradication of poverty, which is a kind of fundamental of, the Lutheran faith and, flattening out and the first shall be last and the last shall be first, etc. There's very much a sense of propriety and trust and helping one another that's kind of formalized in the Lutheran Church. So then, of course, it means your conscience can rest a little easier.
Very good. Well, we now turn even further north, inside the Arctic Circle, and to an area accompanying parts of Norway, Sweden, Finland, and even Russia, popularly known throughout the world as Lapland, and home to the Sami people and their unique musical culture of yoiking. Andrew, could you give us a brief introduction to the Sami people and yoiking in general?
Of course, yeah. And actually, the what you were asking me about Lutheran Church is kind of relevant here, because the Sami is they're the kind of the only sort of remaining indigenous tribe in Europe, and they are from the far reaches of the region, as you say, and traditional activities or living was herding reindeer, but they've kind of come under a lot of pressure, maybe that's the wrong word, but oppression more over the last century as Scandinavia and Finland have modernized. The church wanted to drive out the Sami traditions and saw them as sort of heathens, and then there've been linguistic debates, there've been land right issues, and one of the kind of battlegrounds emerged in the 1970s and 80s was the yoik, the traditional song of the Sami, which is very hard to describe. I mean, the Sami believe that the fairies and the elves gave them yoiking, which is a sort of form of wordless singing, which it's a kind of transitive verb. So, I could yoik you, Paul, which would be a kind of wordless song in which I conjure up your spirit or the spirit of your birthday of some such. I mean, you have to have it in your blood, I think, to be able to do it and even to describe it. But it's such a fascinating a tradition, and it's like the chain dancing in the Faroe Islands, it still lives, and it's been variously used politically by Eurovision in the 1980s to sort of make political points about Norwegian government policies, and then it's been used. There was a sort of pop label emerged in the 1970s from the far north of Norway, which kind of tried to make yoiking pop records and kind of quickly went by the wayside. But discovering it for me has been really fascinating, and to sort of let yourself be drawn into this world where someone's this kind of murmuring voice they actually believe can transform a human into an animal or into another creature in the moment of yoiking. And it's a very, very distinct skill.
And would you be able to introduce the excerpt of yoiking that you've got for us?
Sure. I mean, I don't know how this word is pronounced because my Sami isn't too hot. But this is a track called Biegal. Yeah, you get the idea. And it is from a remarkable album called Yrkeslatter, which is Songs for Yrkesjarvi, a place in the far north of Sweden where an organist called Gunnar Idenstam gathered together a yoiker and some folk musicians and some rock musicians and created this extraordinary album on Bis. And this track gives you a taste of yoiking from the very beginning, but also Swedish folk music and other forms of Swedish music too.
Another composer who's been very influenced by the Sami people is Outi Tarkiainen, with her new work, The Earth, Spring's Daughter, which is the first song cycle set in the Sami language. Andrew, is the use of the Sami language here analogous to the way in which Sibelius composed works in Finnish at the time when Swedish was the predominant language in Finland?
Well, there are certain parallels, but I think not really, because what Outsi's doing here is sort of giving the Sami language a whole new context. I mean, it's never been used in this sort of setting before, and it's really being used as a sort of protest on behalf of the Sami who Outi has long felt are still not given the respect they deserve by the Nordic governments, and this is an ongoing issue. It's very interesting that Outi is a wonderful composer who is extremely strong-willed, and I feel has felt her own struggle to sort of not find her voice, because her voice has always been very strong, but her place and acceptance as a female composer is kind of mirrored by the Sami and their struggle to survive and the struggle to sort of maintain their way of life, which is constantly either under threat or kind of used as a sort of cheapened by gimmickry. And there was a song, a set of pieces written a couple of years ago by a composer, a Norwegian composer, I think Asheim is his name, who he took the 21 words that the Sami have for snow and set 21 individual pieces. And it wasn't so much a setting of Sami, it was a sort of response to the Sami language and its specificity. They are dealing so much with snow that they have these 21 snow states to describe. So that was slightly different. But I think what Outi does here is kind of lay out, a Sami creation myth, but also her strength of feeling about how we have to respect these people's tradition. We have to be very, very careful about how we assume that our kind of, European values must apply to everyone on the continent. And these are the only people on the continent, or one of the only peoples on the continent, I suppose you could talk about the Roma too, that actually do have a distinct identity that's kind of shrinking and threatens to be overwhelmed by our way of life.
And that is still a big political issue in Scandinavia, is the relationship with the Sami people.
It is, yeah. I mean, and there's lots of work being done to try and address it. But of course, the tools are blunt, and we can't always be as eloquent as musicians and composers. And that's why a work like this can have such power.
Inevitably, when discussing Nordic composers, we must turn to Sibelius. But as like the Grieg, a side of his compositional output which is perhaps not well known outside of Finland. Andrew, Sibelius is often regarded as one of the most prominent in the nationalist school of composers, and this setting is from the first Finnish language novel, Seitsemän Veljesta. How important a figure was Sibelius in the growing nationalist movement in Finland, and does his fame in Finland rest not only on his music, but also in his role as a Finnish icon?
Actually, one of the biggest Finnish hip-hop artists, a guy called Paleface, was talking to me about Sibelius a few years ago, and someone coming from that tradition, it was just so fascinating to hear him say, that Sibelius was the only composer who managed to unite the both sides in the Finnish Civil War. He was the one thing that people sort of seemed to agree on. This is the Civil War that happened shortly after Finnish independence in 1917. And I think, Sibelius was very, very clever with what he did, realizing that he could create an international language, an internationally significant musical language using a very distinct elements of the Finnish language and the Finnish folk tradition. And you hear it all over, the kind of, like you were asking about Danish, Finnish language even more influences, I think, the shape of Sibelius's melodies and tunes and all these long melodies with kind of repeated notes and then a tail at the end, very much resembling spoken Finnish. The idea of the rune song and the idea of the sort of the rune singer who would sit and repeat and slowly modify the phrase and therefore create this kind of cyclic cumulative structure, which is Sibelius at his organic best. Lemminkainen, Sixth Symphony, Seventh Symphony. It's just endlessly fascinating what he did. I mean, the piece that I've chosen to play is not so much representative of that as more, I guess, his attachment to the Lutheran tradition we've been talking about for so long, because that's something again that is so important in his music. If you think about the symphonies, I guess 2, 3, 5, 7, 1 that all end in a kind of hymn, like a kind of chorale like moment of not so much victory as kind of like hope, I would say. And again, a composer who experienced dark patches and he seems constantly just searching for hope, searching for sort of one answer in his life.
Could that perhaps be a reason for his years of silence after his Seventh Symphony, that he felt he had achieved what he set out to do, both compositionally and for Finland?
Well, Finland was changing hugely in the years when Sibelius was alive but not writing. I mean, tango had become huge at that point, imported from Argentina. Pop music was starting to infiltrate, the consciousness. There was cinema. Sibelius felt himself isolated, and I really feel he felt himself used politically in that period. I think that perhaps made him feel a little redundant musically, but also, if you look at Tapiola and The Tempest, in a way there was nowhere for him to go. He distilled his music down to the point where it had kind of become invisible, and perhaps the silence was the natural state for him after that. I mean, again, so the idea of silence is something that I'm trying to grapple with in the book I'm writing, because I feel that the long shadow of that silence has made itself very much felt over the Nordic region, and still is doing so, especially in Denmark, where Sibelius is very highly regarded as well. I'm not so sure about the silence. I mean, I think there are ingredients to Sibelius's collapse of confidence in his last years, definitely.
So that was from Sibelius' 6 songs, Opus 18, performed by the YL Male Voice Choir and conducted by Matti Hjokki. Well, his last words there mention retreating into the forest, and we must now sadly retreat and return to our homes, wherever they may be. Well, they say that travel broadens the mind, and I hope this virtual travel has managed to do the same thing. Very good luck with your book, Andrew. When do you hope it will be released?
Thanks very much. I don't know. I'm about 60% of the way through writing, so it's a way off yet, but I would imagine maybe sometime at the back end of 2021 with a fair wind.
Well, you've been the consummate tour guide, and I hope the book is released to great success. I personally, for one, can't wait till it's released. Thank you very much for listening, and thank you to my producer, Matt Groom.